in an interesting change in tactics and strategy, Russia is using horses, camels, and donkeys on the battlefield in Ukraine for movement and logistics. Now, Russia's use of these animals to move supplies in Ukraine is a response to some serious logistical problems. For starters, Russian forces have lost a huge number of military vehicles, including trucks and armored transports. With these losses stacking up, they don't have enough conventional means to move equipment, ammunition, or even basic supplies like food and medical gear. On top of that, Ukraine's terrain isn't exactly friendly to vehicles right now because of the muddy season. And so while trucks and other vehicles struggle, animals like donkeys and horses can handle that kind of rough terrain much more easily. And then there's also drones. That has become a major problem for Russia. Ukrainian forces have turned drones into one of their most effective weapons, making it incredibly risky for Russian supplies and convoys to move around. Large, loud vehicles moving on known roadways become easy targets. But animals on foot in the backcountry, well, they're smaller, quieter, and much less likely to get spotted and attacked. In this kind of warfare where every bit of movement is being watched, that can be an advantage. And the U.S. discovered that early in the war in Afghanistan. U.S. Special Forces from Operational Detachment Alpha 5th Group were deployed to Afghanistan as part of the initial invasion. Faced with Afghanistan's rugged mountainous terrain, they actually adapted by using horses provided by the Northern Alliance, which was a local resistance group fighting the Taliban. This return to cavalry tactics allowed the U.S. forces to navigate areas inaccessible by modern vehicles while coordinating airstrikes and engaging in attacks on the enemy. Now, the success of these horseback operations became quite legendary, earning the soldiers the nickname Horse Soldiers. Their story was actually later adopted into a book and a movie called 12 Strong. But there's a key difference here. The horses used in Afghanistan were for a tactical advantage in extreme mountain terrain. Russia is using them to move supplies. The reason the U.S. did not need them to move supplies is because the U.S. had air superiority and could resupply deep into the mountains with helicopters, something the Russians cannot do due to not having air superiority in Ukraine. But also, in Afghanistan, helicopter insertions of troops and quads or four-wheelers is a loud endeavor, and it's quite impractical when you need to maneuver quietly in harsh mountain terrain, so horses were used. But that begs the question, how is Russia using their horses and camels and donkeys? Well, reports from Russian military bloggers and Ukrainian officials suggest that they're mainly being used to carry ammunition, food, and supplies to frontline troops, especially in areas where the troops are finding it difficult to move a vehicle. And the interesting thing is this doesn't seem like a planned top-down strategy from Russian leadership. It's more like local commanders and soldiers are just figuring things out on the ground using whatever resources they can find. And so they're using horses and donkeys, sometimes taking them from local farms. Naturally, all of this has sparked a lot of reaction. Many people have mocked Russia for resorting to using pack animals, calling it a sign of desperation and a symbol of just how badly their logistics has crumbled. But here's the thing, that's an easy target for criticism. However, I see it, and some military analysts see it differently. From a purely strategic standpoint, it's pragmatic. They're doing what they can. In a war where cutting-edge technology is constantly evolving and countering itself, sometimes the best solution is a simple one. If modern vehicles can't do the job without getting destroyed, and if traditional supply lines are way too vulnerable, then they're going to have to go back to some of the basics. And I can give a personal example of a similar situation when we had to go back to basics when I was training multinational forces in Germany. On the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan, we had huge technological advantages. So we would have massive tactical operations centers, also known as TOCs, with walls of TVs. Vehicles had their own screens with GPS. Soldiers had handhelds, all giving off light and electronic warfare signals. To the insurgents in the Middle East, there was really nothing they could do about that to exploit those signals, but Russia can. In fact, they can pinpoint where a signal is coming from and call artillery fire on that spot. So what exactly was I training NATO forces to use again? Going back to the basics, paper maps with a red lens flashlight under your poncho at night so night vision couldn't pick you up. Now, this was back when we thought the Russians had similar night vision capabilities to us in the US, which obviously proved to be false, but nonetheless, it's still a good tactic to learn. The more advanced we become, it seems the more we will have to rely on old tactics. Now, back to these Russian horses and camels and donkeys, officially the Kremlin and military leadership have mostly stayed quiet, though some state and pro-Russian media sources have tried to spin it in a different light than there's just a poor logistics capability here by drawing comparisons to how the Soviet army actually used animals in past conflicts, specifically again in Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, this is just one more example of how war forces adaptation. The fact that what was supposed to be a major military power is using camels, donkeys, and horses in 2025 speaks volumes about the intensity of the conflict, the effectiveness of Ukraine's countermeasures, and the lengths Russia seems to be willing to go to keep its forces supplied. using an old school solution in a high-tech war. And whether it's a sign of resilience or a symbol of struggle, and I believe it to be both, it tells us one thing for sure. This war is pushing both sides to rethink everything they know about how modern battles are fought. And again, NATO and the West is watching and taking notes.